If you want your GoPro Mission 1 Pro footage to look incredible, this video is for you. I'm going to show you everything you need to know to capture the most incredible cinematic looking footage with the Mission 1. Now, first of all, this is a small step, but make sure you have your lens hood attached to your Mission 1. This lens hood is going to help keep ugly lens flares off your GoPro, and ugly lens flares are not going to give you cinematic, good-looking footage, so you don't want those. Make sure when you have on the lens hood, this part right here is not pushed down and under the lens cover. If it is, it's going to potentially show parts of this in your frame, and you definitely don't want that. I made that mistake early on, and I quickly figured it out. It was that this was slightly crooked and not on there properly. So make sure it's seated proper with this little tab right here in front of the lens cover. So the first thing we need to do is there's two things we need to turn on in the general menu. We're gonna swipe down, we're gonna swipe left, and you're gonna select Preferences. And then you're going to go down here to Displays. And the first one you want to toggle on, if it's not already on, is Capture Info. And the other thing you want to toggle on is the grid down here. Once you have toggled those two on, when we go back to the main screen here, you're going to see those values right up here. So the S represents the shutter speed, the ISO of course represents the ISO, the EV represents the exposure value, and the WB up here represents the white balance. Next, we're going to change some key video settings that are really going to help you dial in that cinematic look. If you're not already in the video mode, just toggle left or right and select video right here. Once you click here on the bottom, you've got a couple different options, and some of these options are going to depend if you have the Mission 1 or the Mission 1 Pro. But the great news for you, regardless of which one you have, you're still going to be able to capture those incredible cinematic results. However, you simply won't have the open gate option available on the Mission 1 like you will on the Mission 1 Pro. Open gate is a way you can use the entirety of the sensor, and if you film in 4x3 using that, you're going to have a little bit extra vertical footage at the top and the bottom that you can use later on to add some movement in your scene if you want to. But if you don't have that, don't worry. Just go over here and select 16:9, and then you're going to be able to use the rest of the settings here. But if you do have the Mission 1 Pro, I recommend keeping it at 4x3. If you are filming in the daylight, you want to use 8K. You want to have that flexibility later on to crop in, and it's ultimately going to give you the very best looking footage, especially when you export it on a 4K timeline. There's going to be a lot of pixels there that are crammed together in that space. Everything's going to look really clean and really good. Now, as far as the frame rate goes, if you're doing 4x3 8K, you're going to have 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. But if you do 16:9, you're going to be able to go all the way up to 60 frames per second in 8K. Now, if you have scenes where you want to slow it down a little bit later on to 8K 60, and you're going to be able to do that. Now, one note before we proceed, you do want to select 4K if you're going to be filming in low light. I've used this camera quite a bit in low light, and the 4K, the advantages to that is the pixel size. Because of the quad Bayer technology, your pixel size is going to be bigger in 4K, and that has a lot of advantages in low light because you're not going to suffer from that grain and noise in your video. When you're using a higher ISO, 4K is going to look much cleaner. So if you are filming in low light, like these samples right here, where I used 4K, I highly recommend using 4K. It's going to give you the very best look. But going back to 8K, for the frames per second down here, if I'm filming footage that I want to be at the default speed in which I'm capturing it, I'm going to use 24 frames per second. The reason for that is going to produce the most motion blur later on, and I'll show you in a moment what I mean by that. That motion blur and that slower shutter speed is one of the keys to getting that real cinematic footage. And of course, if you don't live in the United States and you live in a country with the PAL standard, then I recommend selecting 25. For this next section right here, you want to leave everything as it is. You don't want to have zoomed in at all. You want to keep that at 1x. Like I said, if we're filming in 8K, you can always crop it later on. But you don't want to set any of these for cinematic footage. Image, this is where there are a lot of key settings that are going to separate your footage from the average person using the stock settings. First of all, for the image tuning, you can keep this at balanced. Balanced is going to give us what we want. The only exception would be if you're filming footage underwater. You do want to set it to underwater because it will make a big difference in your footage. For the digital lens, you have a couple options here. And which one you use does not necessarily make or break your cinematic footage. If you have a lot of people that you're filming, I do recommend going down here to digital lens linear. And then I do also recommend turning on the horizon lock if you want to keep that horizon level at all times. Now the trade-off with that is if you turn it on, it is going to introduce some crop. If I turn it back off, you can see that gets a little bit wider. So in general, I don't recommend turning on horizon lock unless you have a real need to keep that perfectly level. Sometimes that can take away too much of that natural motion and it can almost make it feel fake. So if you have people or city buildings, anything like that where you don't want any fisheye, film those in the linear mode and you're gonna love how it looks. But if you're doing something like hiking or filming a lot of outdoor landscapes or biking, anything like that, I do recommend using the digital lens wide. Wide is going to do a good job, and anything you don't want distorted, as long as you keep it near the center of the lens, you're gonna be fine. But if you are filming anything at the edges of the lens that you don't want any distortion with, then you do want to go back to linear. For hypersmooth, I recommend having hypersmooth turned on, but I don't recommend going to auto boost. Auto boost basically makes it too smooth and it takes away a lot of that natural feel. So I recommend just keeping it simply at on. For the bit depth, you definitely, most certainly want to have this in 10-bit. If you are not filming in 10-bit, you are missing out on a lot of colors because 10-bit has 1 billion possible color shades. But if you're in 8-bit down here, you're only getting 16 million shades. So 1 billion is a lot more color shades and it's going to really show in your footage. And this setting right here is one of the most important settings for the bitrate. You want to have this at max. And yes, max is going to produce larger file sizes to some degree. However, GoPro with the HEVC codec with this, they have actually made it surprisingly efficient. So even though that bitrate is up to 240 megabits per second, the file size is not as big as I expected. So you want to have this in max. I don't recommend using high or standard because those are just not going to have the highest quality and your quality could suffer later on when you upload it to share. When it gets compressed, for the HLG HDR, keep that off. And then down here for the color, for cinematic footage, you want to select the GP Log 2. And if you're thinking, well, I don't know how to grade GP Log 2, don't worry. At the end of this video, I'm going to direct you to my video where I go in depth on grading GP Log 2 footage. And in that video, I also offer you some free LUTs and looks that are going to make the grading super easy for you. And you're going to really be able to dial in that look you want. And you don't have to be an expert. But I'm going to show you every step you can take as well. That way, if you want to customize anything, you can do that. And then for the shutter speed right here, this is probably the most important key to getting cinematic footage. First of all, we want to go to fixed. And here is where there's going to be two paths to take. First of all, if you are using a gimbal and filming in 24 frames per second, you will want to set that shutter speed to 1/48. If you are not using a gimbal, if you don't want to buy one, don't worry. There's a setting you can change here where you don't have to worry about jitter and ghosting in your footage, and you can still get some motion blur. It's not going to be as much as the 1/48, but it is still going to tone down those really sharp frames that you would see if you keep it at default. For instance, if you're filming on a bright sunny day with this camera, the shutter speeds are going to go way high. They're going to go to 1/800, 1/1200. I've even seen 1/2000 or higher. And those frames do not look good when you have motion. They feel stuttery, they don't feel natural, and it's definitely not a cinematic look. And by the way, if you're wondering which gimbal I do use the GoPro Fluid Pro AI. So I've got it right here in its case, and I love the case this gimbal comes in. Really nice case. Makes it easy to keep it stored in there securely. But the reason you need a gimbal more like this and not some of those budget-friendly ones I've featured in the past, it's because the Mission 1 Pro weighs more than 200 grams, and the max payload for those budget-friendly gimbals maxes out at 200 grams. And I've tried this on those, and unfortunately, those gimbal motors cannot support the Mission 1 or the Mission 1 Pro. But if you are using a gimbal, you can still keep Hypersmooth on, and you're going to get the best of both worlds. So if you do not want to use a gimbal, then what you want to do is you want to set your shutter speed to 1/192. If you set your shutter speed in 24 frames per second to 1/192, you are not going to have jitter in your footage. It is going to be a fast enough shutter speed that even with Hypersmooth turned on, Hypersmooth is still going to be able to stabilize those frames properly, and you're not going to have the jitter. However, something very important to note is regardless of if you're using 1/48 or 1/192, if you are filming in the daytime, you're going to have ND filters. And the reason for that, if we go out of here for a moment, your footage is going to be overexposed. So right now I'm filming in the evening and the footage is actually fine right now. But if you're filming in the daytime, this would be completely white, meaning it would be way blown out and completely unusable. So what you'll need is you will need ND filters. And unfortunately right now, the ND filters from GoPro are very difficult to find. And at the time of filming this video, there are not any third-party ND filters that I have seen yet. However, my favorite brand for ND filters, Freewell, I have talked to them recently, and they have said they are working on ND filters, and I'm really excited to get those as soon as they're ready. So I will definitely feature those as soon as I get those. But in the meantime, I've got these ND filters right here from GoPro. And these are ND8, ND16, ND32, and ND64. And all of the samples I'm showing you in this video today were filmed using these ND filters. So what I want to show you next is I want to show you how to put an ND filter on the Mission 1 or Mission 1 Pro. So first of all, what we want to do here is we want to take off the lens hood. So I'm going to pull that off. And then the second thing we want to do is we just want to pull out on the lens cover, and we're going to turn to the left. And it's going to turn about 45 degrees there, and it's going to pull off. So for current lighting conditions, because it is later in the day and overcast right now, I'm going to select ND8 right here. So we're going to pull that out, and we're going to look on the underside, and we're going to see the blue dot right there. So that blue dot, we need to line up with this blue dot right here. So all we've got to do is we're going to put it on like this at an angle, and we're going to twist to the right while holding it. And after we've attached it, we just want to take a look here. We want to make sure there's no uneven gaps here. If we look at it here from the side angle, everything looks great. This is very symmetrical. So after we've attached the ND filter, we then need to confirm that we're using the proper ND filter for our current lighting. So with ND8 on there, what we want to do is we want to look at our values up here. First of all, our shutter speed is 1/48. We want that value because we're going to be using a gimbal. So that value, we want to stay locked. We don't want to change it. The ISO value though, we want to look at that. And currently the ISO value is bouncing around very close to 800. So what I'm going to show you in a moment is I'm going to show you the auto ISO range to have this at. But hint, we don't want the ISO to go over 800. So in this case, ND8 would be too strong and we would need to take it back off, and we would not need any ND filter currently. But if you were to see values here that were down at 100 or below, and things were looking overexposed, say our EV value was above 0 there, which currently we're actually slightly underexposed. But basically what we want at the end of the day, we want our shutter speed and our ND filter combination to result in an ISO that's between 100 to about 400. We want to be in that range. And ideally it's going to be somewhere right there in the middle, because that's going to give us a little bit of flexibility if the sun goes under a cloud or something like that. We don't want it hitting up against either of those boundaries. However, if it does go over the 400 a little bit, let's say it's around 600, maybe even touching 700 briefly some of the time, that's fine. That's still going to be a good ND filter to use. But with our ND filter and our shutter speed, we want to make sure that our EV value is sitting at 0 or between negative 0.3 or plus 0.3. So we want the EV to not stray outside those boundaries either. So in this case, I'm going to take the ND filter back off because we don't need it right now. And when I take that off, you can see what happens. The ISO drops way down to about 165 there, and our EV value goes back to 0.0. So that's perfect. That's a great exposure right there to film that footage. And by the way, with the ND filters, you can have the rubber lens hood on as well with those. And I highly recommend putting it back on once you've selected your ND filter that you're going to use. And just a really important note here, with the exposure triangle up here, you don't merely want to balance the exposure triangle, you want to balance it on your terms. And that's what capturing cinematic footage is all about. So now that we've established our static shutter speed, we're going to go here to white balance. And one of the keys here is you want to have this at some type of static value. And the reason for that is going to make the grading process so much easier later on. So if you were filming during the daytime, you want to select 5500K here. 5500K is going to keep that white balance consistent, even though the white balance is subtly changing all the time. It's going to be in that same general range during the daytime. If you're filming around sunrise or sunset during that golden hour, you want to go up here to 6500. And then if you are filming in low light at nighttime, you want to go down here to 3200 for the white balance. That's going to help you get that really good white balance with city lights at night or anything in low light. But most of the time, if you're like me, you're probably going to be filming during the daytime, so I'm going to put it back to 5500K. And then the ISO range that I was talking about. So first of all, you want to make sure to select range down here. And second, you want to select 25 to 800. So when I just mentioned getting that proper ISO value, I should have clarified that technically the ISO can go below 100 on here. It can go all the way down to 25. But the incredible thing about the 25 to 800 is when you have that exposure perfect and your camera can hover around 50 to 100 for the ISO, that's when you're getting the really cleanest image out of your GoPro. It takes a little bit of practice and getting used to it, but thanks to having these values right up here in the top, you're able to keep track of that really closely. Like right now our ISO is 135, and that's perfect. 135 is going to yield really clean footage. So after you've selected that ISO, we're gonna scroll down here and you wanna make sure sharpness is set to low. Having low sharpness is also a key feature of cinematic footage. You don't want your footage over sharpened. If you need to add sharpness later on, you can always add a little bit of that and that's fine, but you don't want it baked into the footage. It's not gonna look good. And then another key right here, denoise, keep this at low with the only exception if you're filming in low light or at nighttime. If you're filming in low light or at nighttime, you can put this up to medium, and that's going to help that footage look cleaner. But during the daytime in good lighting, you simply don't need denoising. As long as you're keeping that ISO below 800 and you're not underexposing your footage, you're gonna have clean shadows, and you're not gonna have to worry about that noise later on when you grade the footage. And then one note down here about the audio. For the audio, I don't recommend using the built-in mics if you're going to be doing a lot of talking with this. They will yield usable audio, but ultimately you probably want to use a wireless mic. And I've recently picked up the GoPro wireless mic kit, and spoiler alert, I haven't released a video on it yet, but I have tried out the mic with it wirelessly paired to here, and the quality is really good because GoPro doesn't just use that default Bluetooth standard. They actually have a higher standard where the quality is cleaner, and it is very crisp and it's very easy to use with this camera. So if you're looking for a wireless mic that works natively and will yield the best quality sound with the Mission 1, I highly recommend picking up the GoPro kit. And if you just want that standalone wireless mic and not the whole kit, it is very affordable from GoPro. I believe it is less than $50. I recommend getting just the transmitter if that's all you want, a simple mic to pair to this. That's gonna be a great choice. So now that you've captured that footage, it's time to grade the footage. And in order to do so, you're gonna wanna check out this video right here. In this video, I'm going to show you step-by-step everything you need to grade that GP Log 2 footage. And in addition, I have free LUTs and looks for you. and they're going to make creating the GP Log 2 footage super easy.